Hello, everyone, and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. This is Sarah Small. I'm Food Tank's Global Events Director. And I'm really excited about today's webinar with Larissa Walker. She's the Pollinator Campaign Director for Center for Food Safety. Larissa integrates national grassroots campaigns with hard-hitting scientific and legal expertise, working with lawmakers on Capitol Hill and regulators at key government agencies to affect positive policy change. She also spearheads the Center for Food Safety's Pollinators and Pesticides program, which focuses on protecting bees, butterflies, and other beneficial insects from the harms of pesticides in industrial agriculture. Today, Larissa's presentation will focus on whether federal efforts go far enough to save pollinators from further decline, and how individuals can play a role in protecting these incredible species. This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com afterwards. And you can follow along and participate on Twitter using #FoodTank. And please submit your questions using the questions chat box in your control panel to the right side of your screen. And you can also send me your questions at sarah@foodtank.com. So without further ado, Larissa, it's wonderful to have you here today, and I'm excited to hear your presentation. I'll give you the floor now.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's an honor to be here, and I'm so grateful to Food Tank for giving me this opportunity. So I'm looking forward to discussing my favorite topic with you all today, pollinators. And just a bit of background about Center for Food Safety. We're a national nonprofit organization, and we work to protect human health and the environment from harmful food production technologies. And one of those harmful technologies is, of course, pesticides. So a little over 3 years ago, Center for Food Safety decided to get involved with pollinator issues after learning more about a particularly harmful class of pesticides being used in agriculture and elsewhere. So that's what we'll be discussing today. So you've likely heard quite a bit about pollinator declines in recent years. It started with colony collapse disorder, which got a lot of attention in the mid-2000s when beekeepers across the country began reporting these abnormally high colony losses with their honeybees. And it was quite a problem at that time because beekeepers, of course, travel around the country pollinating a variety of our crops. But these losses were quite severe for beekeepers, so much so that it was presenting a financial hardship for them and really compromising their operation. So at the time when colony collapse disorder was termed, scientists kind of thought of it as this mysterious phenomenon and bees just mysteriously vanishing, and they really weren't sure what was going on. And since that time, the situation has not improved. If anything, it's gotten worse for many beekeepers, but we have a lot more knowledge now about what's going on. It's not really a mystery. So in 2014, President Obama released a presidential memorandum at the tail end of National Pollinator Week, so in June of 2014. And he decided to essentially call on our government agencies to create a federal strategy to promote the health of honeybees and other pollinators. And the White House Pollinator Task Force that he created as part of this presidential memorandum a year ago was established, and it was co-chaired by USDA and the EPA. And since that time, over the last year, that task force has been working with all federal agencies and with stakeholders such as beekeepers and private companies and scientists to create a national pollinator strategy, which was recently released last month. And that national strategy has 3 major goals. That's what you see on the screen here, and it's to reduce honeybee overwintering losses to a more sustainable level, which scientists consider around 15% within the next 10 years, increase the monarch butterfly population to a much higher level than they're at now by 2020, and also restore or enhance 7 million acres of land for pollinators within the next 5 years. And so to achieve these goals, the plan is really relying on more research and four key elements. Research for a pollinator action plan, more public education and outreach, increasing and improving pollinator habitat, and developing public-private partnerships such as with companies and government agencies. So before we look at whether the White House can actually achieve these really ambitious goals that it's set out, I want to take a step back and provide a bit of background about the pollinator issue and what's really impacting bees. So there are a number of factors that are affecting bees and other pollinators. One of the biggest ones, and in our minds, the most problematic factor facing bees, a leading cause of their decline, is pesticides. But bees are also threatened by habitat loss, the lack of good forage for them to access, and have good nutrition. They're threatened by parasites like the varroa mite and diseases. And they're also threatened by extreme weather conditions. Climate change and harsh weather conditions are very problematic for. But the pesticide issue has become increasingly threatening for pollinators, and it's a leading factor in impacting not just their population size, but their overall health. And it is the one factor out of all of these factors that we can do something about immediately. So I'm going to focus on that for a bit and go into the background here with the pesticide problem. There is a particular class of pesticides that you may have heard about in recent years called neonicotinoids. We call them neonics for short. And they're a class of insecticides that damage the central nervous system of bees and other insects. They are a form of a nicotine-based chemical, and they're also systemic. So that's really a new technology for this type of insecticide, and basically it allows the chemical to actually be taken up into plants and then expressed throughout all of the plant tissue. So that includes the pollen and the nectar, which is obviously a problem for bees. The roots, the dew droplets on the leaves, every part of the plant is toxic and contains this chemical. And neonicotinoid use has skyrocketed since they were first introduced in the mid-1990s in the United States. As you can see on this graph, their use has increased, as have the number of neonicotinoid chemicals that are on the market. And it's estimated that there are actually over 500 different neonic products in use today. And I'd like to point out, too, that it's not beekeepers have noticed this. It might not be a coincidence that the same time beekeepers started experiencing these very high colony losses in the mid-2000s is about the same time that neonicotinoid use really took off and started increasing in the US. So to show the increase in use in a different way and present this to you differently, these maps that I'm going to go through are showing neonicotinoid use for one particular neonicotinoid chemical. It's the oldest one, called imidacloprid. And you'll see as time progressed, the amount of this chemical that we're using across the country has really just increased tremendously. This is 2004, 2009, and 2011. So we're using a lot more of these chemicals now in a variety of ways. And this is a problem, obviously, because not only are these pesticides toxic in general to insects, but they're extremely toxic to bees. They can be up to 5,000 to 10,000 times more toxic to bees than DDT. And that's been a big, big problem for beekeepers. Their use can have immediate effects and kill bees outright, as you can see in these photos. This is an example of an acute kill where bees were exposed to a high amount of neonics and died outright. But they can also have long-term effects on pollinators, more subtle effects that build up over time and impact bees that way. A couple of years ago, there was an incident in a Target parking lot in Oregon, and pesticide applicators came in and treated a number of blooming linden trees in the parking lot. And within hours, there were just piles of dead bumblebees on the parking lot, trembling or dead. And that was another example of an acute kill from uses of neonics. But as I mentioned, there are also sublethal or chronic effects that can adversely impact bees and other pollinators. And this is different from those acute effects that we just witnessed. So the chronic effects include things like compromised immune systems, impaired foraging and navigation abilities. And one of the symptoms of colony collapse disorder, when scientists weren't really sure what was causing these bee declines and mysterious bee absence in the hive, was that bees couldn't find their way back to their hive. The hives were just empty. And that's actually, now scientists have discovered that one of the effects of neonics is impaired navigation. So bees' learning and memory capabilities are damaged, and their reproductive capabilities are also damaged. So these are all effects that happen when bees are exposed to neonicotinoids over time. And it's also important to point out that bees are not the only pollinator being impacted by neonics. New research out just this past year has found that neonics also harm really bad, given that monarchs have declined by 90% in 20 years. Their populations are absolutely in jeopardy right now. And beyond monarchs, there's also research showing severe impacts of neonics to birds and to aquatic invertebrates, to a variety of species. So how are bees and other pollinators exposed to these chemicals? Unfortunately, since we're using neonics in ways that we never used insecticides before, such as a coating on seeds, there are many ways that pollinators are exposed to these chemicals. The largest single use of neonics is as a seed coating. We essentially use neonics and often other pesticides like a fungicide as a coating onto a variety of seeds for annual field crops like corn, soy, canola, cotton, wheat. We never used to coat seeds with an insecticide prior to neonics. But seed coatings aren't the only application. There are also direct trunk injections. There are foliar sprays, which many people, typically think of when we think of a pesticide application. Soil drenches, and even granules that we sprinkle onto soil that contain these chemicals. So needless to say, because there are a number of ways that we're using neonics, there are also many ways for pollinators to become exposed to these chemicals. As I mentioned before, the fact that these are systemic chemicals and taken up into the plant system means that bees are exposed to them in pollen and nectar. Bees also need to drink water just like we do, and so water, dew droplets on the plant leaves, when bees drink that, they will be exposed to chemicals in the plant. These are very, very persistent chemicals. They have half-lives of several years in soil, sometimes in rare soil conditions, up to 10 years or more. So bees, many native bees, about 70% of native bees actually live in the soil. So they're exposed there as well. And I'd also like to point out that over the past several years, researchers have found that in many cases, neonic seed coatings, which as I mentioned are the largest use of these chemicals, provide little to no benefit to farmers. And I think this is really shocking, given that we're coating a majority of seeds, but it's not actually needed. It's not benefiting farmers. And in many ways, the harms from coating these seeds far outweigh the benefits. And by that, I mean that not only are farmers basically shooting themselves in the foot, and not intentionally, they're being sold these seeds by chemical companies or seed distributors, but they're jeopardizing, healthy pollination services for their fields. They're impacting the beneficial insects that might reside in their soil or in their fields that would typically control some and not doing what we thought they were supposed to. But agricultural applications are not the only use of neonics. We can actually purchase many neonic products in nursery stores, such as Home Depot, Lowe's, and other garden stores. And since a lot of people don't often follow the label instructions when applying these chemicals, researchers have found that the application rates for garden and landscape uses can be much, much higher than agricultural uses. So there's a lot more residue present in the environment around the application to expose pollinators to. And if you or your neighbor wants to make sure that you're not using any of these products containing neonics, Center for Food Safety does have a list of products on our website that you can access and share with your friends and neighbors. Okay, so now we've covered how neonics are affecting bees, but another question is, so what? Why does this matter? And I'm sure this audience, of course, is already well aware of the importance of bees, but I'll underscore the point that bees and other pollinators are absolutely critical to agriculture. A couple of the photos on the screen, the one on the left is showing a stunt that a Whole Foods store in Rhode Island actually did a couple of years ago, where they removed all of the produce in the produce would, so it's quite a different availability. So it's not to say that we would starve without bees, but our diets would absolutely be much less diverse and a lot unhealthier. And the picture on the right is showing an area in China where pesticide use has become so heavy that the native bees in that area, in the agricultural area, have been wiped out, and beekeepers don't want to take their honeybees into these orchards and expose their bees to the pesticides, so they've had to resort to hand pollination. And there are many crops, such as almonds, that are 100% dependent upon honeybees for pollination. Native bees can also play a good role. California, for instance, provides 80% of the world's almond supply. And we need about more than 3/4 of all of the honeybee hives in the country right now just to meet the demand. So every fit to California to pollinate almonds, because without honeybees and in some cases the native bees in those areas, we would not have the almond production that we do. But beyond agricultural benefits, bees are also an indicator species. And if bees are not doing well, or monarch butterflies are not healthy, that's usually indicative of a larger environmental or human health problem. So I mentioned earlier that beyond monarchs, there have been impacts that we've recognized to other insects and other species that neonics are harming. That includes birds. Researchers have found that one neonic-coated corn kernel is enough to contains enough of the chemical to kill a songbird. And there are also concerns with respect to beneficial insects and potentially even humans. And the research there is still developing. So going back to the White House strategy, I first should say it's incredible that we even have a national pollinator strategy. That's pretty fantastic. Clearly, the White House understands the importance of pollinators. But going back to their goals for improving pollinator populations and their health, if you go through the strategy, you'll notice a really obvious hole in their plan, and that's dealing with pesticide issues. So pesticides are mentioned in the plan, though minimally, and the parts of the plan that do deal with pesticide issues are really skirting around the edges. And there are a few big reasons why that's a problem, and why without addressing the pesticide issue head on, we really can't achieve the goals that the White House has set out to drastically improve pollinator health. So to give a little bit of detail, the White House plan certainly focuses a lot on habitat, but one of our concerns is that if we're putting all of this time and energy and resources into improving pollinator habitat, it's essentially just going to become another area, a toxic area for pollinators to become exposed to pesticides if we're not actually preventing pesticides from being used in those areas. And as I mentioned, neonic-coated seeds are the largest use of neonics, and we're planting neonic-coated seeds on more than 100 million acres across the country. So that is a lot of area that there is now an ability for pollinators to continue to become exposed to these chemicals, no matter how much habitat we plant nearby. And because these chemicals are very persistent and long-lasting, and that they're very mobile, there's the potential for areas where neonic-coated seeds are being used to actually run off and contaminate nearby pollinator habitat that's being planted. So the White House really doesn't address the unique hazards posed by neonics, like the persistence, like their mobility, and like their high toxicity. And so another area that they're hoping to kind of lean on doing more with pesticides is by asking for more research. And while more research is useful, there's already enough research showing harm from neonics, and it's enough for the government to take action now. A little over a year ago, the International Union for Conservation of Nature released this report. They had gone through a number of independent scientists across the world, had gone through an extensive literature review and reviewed over 800 published peer-reviewed scientific studies evaluating the harms from neonics and another systemic insecticide, and overwhelmingly concluded that there was enough research showing widespread contamination and environmental problems, including pollinator declines from uses of neonics. So there is absolutely enough independent science available now showing harm from these chemicals, and we need to do more on it. We're going to continue pressuring the White House to take action on neonics. Its task force is still active, and it's still progressing in its plan to meet its now outlined goals. So as the task force continues to iron out the details of their plan, Center for Food Safety and many of our partner organizations in this fight will continue pressuring the White House to take stronger action on pesticides. And you can certainly become involved in that too by signing petitions that we deliver to the White House, submitting comments to the White House, and that information is all available on our website. But in the meantime, as we wait on the White House to take stronger action, what else can we do? So I'm going to outline 5 key ways that people can become involved and help pollinators. The first is to become a citizen lobbyist. Your voice absolutely matters to your representatives and your senators. The members of Congress listen to their constituents, and there's a really tremendous bill right now in Congress called the Saving America's Pollinators Act. It was introduced by Representative John Conyers and Earl Blumenauer, and it would seek to suspend the 4 most toxic neonics until proven safe. It's the beacon of hope right now for pollinators, and I would absolutely urge you to contact your member of Congress and urge them to become a co-sponsor of this bill. Right now, it's only in the House, it's not in the Senate side, but you can call your representatives and tell them you'd like them to co-sponsor HR 1284. And there's, of course, information on our website about this too. I think it's also important that we encourage government agencies to take action independently of the White House plan. And a good example of a government agency already responding to this issue is with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who has announced that they'll actually be banning neonics on all national wildlife refuges by 2016, January 2016. And that's phenomenal. That means that there are now 150 million acres of land across the US that will not have neonic contamination present. So definitely a more of a safe haven for pollinators. And this follows a decade of legal action by Center for Food Safety and our allies, but also a lot of feedback from the public and from independent scientists. So government agencies do respond and can take action themselves, and we should certainly encourage them to. We have consistently put pressure on the EPA to take action on neonics. They are the ones in charge of pesticide regulation, and they have the ability to remove neonics from the market if they so choose, or at least remove certain uses like seed coatings. So we consistently protest at EPA, we deliver petitions to them, we offer comments about the issue, and that's, I think, really important to keep that pressure on government agencies. There's also grassroots action happening at the national level across the country, not just with government agencies, but also at the marketplace. There's been a lot of great work happening, pressuring Home Depot and Lowe's to take action on neonics, to remove these products from their shelves, to offer plants that are not pre-treated with neonics, so that customers aren't planting pollinator-friendly flowers that are actually contaminated with neonics. And that's really important. And you can become involved in these actions by following Center for Food Safety and a number of other organizations that work on this issue. And we'll let you know when we're going to be doing protests and petition deliveries. And if you're in the area where that's happening, we'd love for you to come out and join us for it. You can also activate your own community. There have been about a dozen actions at the local level so far where different cities and communities are banning the use of neonics, either on public property or in the area. And separate from, say, introducing a city ordinance, you could also consider working with your neighborhood and encouraging your neighborhood to become bee friendly. A great example that's happening has been in Colorado, in Boulder, Colorado, where a number of households all agree that they would not be using neonic chemicals in their area. So this whole community is now a safe haven for pollinators and will not be contaminated by these chemicals. Same thing goes for college campuses. We've been working a lot with college campuses, encouraging them to avoid using these products on their campus with their landscaping. They're not necessary, and there are safer ways to manage pests. There are alternatives that exist to neonics, and I think that that's really important, that in the absence of strong federal action, we do encourage action at the local level. And you can also take action in your own backyard. Obviously, avoid using these products and other harmful pesticide products in your backyard, in your garden. Plant a lot of pollinator-friendly flowers. I'd encourage you to plant flowers that are native to your region. And there's some great guides that exist out there to learn about flowers that are native to your region. Center for Food Safety has a list on our website that's available to you. Provide nesting sites for native bees. Such an important opportunity, especially if I'll hear often from people that I can't keep honeybees in my area. I'm not allowed to have honeybees on my property. That's okay. You could provide a nesting site for native bees. Native bees, you can build nesting sites with little tubes and create tunnels or holes in dead wood in your backyard. There are a lot of resources to do that, and I would highly encourage people to go to the Xerces Society and check out their information about nesting sites for native bees. You could consider keeping honeybees if you're allowed, or even just supporting your local beekeeper by purchasing honey from your local beekeeper. And most importantly, become educated about bees and these issues, and share that knowledge with other people so that they are aware of the problems with these chemicals and what's going on and how they can become involved. Education is key. And so with that, I will end, and I'll look forward to hearing questions from everyone and continuing the dialogue.
Thank you, Larissa. That was a great presentation and really informative. I just want to send a reminder out to our listeners to continue to send your question in via email, the chat tab, or Twitter. But we do have about 10-15 minutes to go through as many questions as possible. And Larissa, I'd just like to start by asking you a question from a listener named Ashley. She asks, what are the alternatives for farmers to use instead of neonics?
It's a great question. One of the, I would first of all consider asking the farmer, well, what is your pest threat? In many cases, the threats that are facing farmers are secondary pest threats, and there are ways that they can control pests without using any pesticides in some cases. Certainly organic farming is an option, but there are also agroecological methods for controlling pests. So I think to avoid pesticides, depending on which pest the farmer is facing in that area, There are a variety of tactics that you can use to evaluate, which type of pest is it? Is there a natural pest predator that can help control that insect? Are there less toxic pesticides available to the farmer that are not neonics, that if the pest outbreak is at a certain level, do they need to use a pesticide? I think it really depends on the area that the farmer is in and the type of pest threat, but I would certainly encourage a variety of agroecological practices, and I'd be happy to email with Ashley and provide her a list depending on the pest threat.
Thanks, Larissa. And our next question comes from a listener named Alyssa, and she asks, what role do cities play in the decline of pollinators, and how can we support pollinators in big cities or urban areas?
I think cities play a really important role. One of the cities that was on the list that I had up of local actions was Seattle. Certainly your city could pass an ordinance to suspend or ban the use of neonics on public property. Cities can also educate their residents about the uses of these chemicals. I think, especially avoiding these chemicals from being used in urban areas. They're often used for landscaping or cosmetic purposes. And I would really question whether we even need them for cosmetic purposes. I mean, in a lot of cases, everyone wants the perfect flower, and you might not need pesticides or neonics to make sure that your garden stays beautiful. So I think cities play a really important role, not just in terms of being able to pass an ordinance and restrict uses of these chemicals, but also in terms of educating the residents about whether these pesticides should be used in their backyard and that they can avoid using them.
Thanks again, Larissa. And our next question comes from our listener named Ryan, and he asks an important question, I think. He says, do we need more pollinator education in schools? Are there any programs out there that educators can seek to replicate?
Absolutely. I would highly encourage more pollinator education in schools. I mean, I can remember when I was in elementary school learning about the monarch butterfly and its life cycle, and it was so fascinating to me. I mean, seeing insects, especially the monarch butterfly, I loved it. But I think there's a lot that teachers can do to educate their students, not just about the life cycles of these incredible creatures, but the threats that are facing them and how students can become involved in helping them. So there are a variety of educational resources available to teachers. Center for Food Safety has a number of toolkits that we work with teachers and colleges to develop. So depending on the age of the student, there are different resources I would suggest. But I think, it's important for students to become educated, and I would love to encourage more teachers to share this knowledge about the importance of pollinators and how students and their families can become involved in protecting them.
Great, thanks again. And we can always share some of those resources with our listeners afterwards as well. The next question comes from Elise, and she asks, how can we change insurance schemes offered to farmers, high crop insurance with neonics compared with non-coated seeds?
That is a fantastic question. I think, that the corporate control of seeds is a really big problem. But we have seen some seed companies already respond to public demand for uncoated seeds. So to give an example of that, grain farmers in Ontario, Canada, in the past couple of years started asking for access to uncoated seed, and DuPont Pioneer came out and responded and said that they would make uncoated seed available to farmers there. To my knowledge, it's not available in the US, and I've heard that's because there's not a demand, or if it's available, it's very difficult to get. And so I think the first thing that we need to do here in the US is to get farmers to start demanding access to uncoated seed, because the issue right now is that, there's probably not much of a difference in price between coated seed and uncoated seed. And you note the insurance kind of mindset. Well, if it's not much more, why wouldn't I just pay a few pennies more to have this insurance benefit of protecting my crop? And I just don't think there's enough education right now about what that actually means if you plant a coated seed and what it's actually doing to the beneficial insects in the soil, or what it's doing to the pollinators in your area. And I think, you know, encouraging farmers to demand access, this is a matter of farmer choice. It's incredible and shocking that, you know, they don't have access to uncoated seed, especially with corn. About 95 to 99% of all corn seed is coated with neonics in the US, and that's just a tremendous amount of the chemicals that we're using because of that. So I definitely think farmers need to start demanding access to uncoated seed.
Definitely. Thank you, Larissa. And then the next question comes from Cecilia. And she asks, in the various studies, has a direct linkage between neonics and the trends of bees dying been established? Example, map of increased usage directly linked to map of dying bees. And she says she's not questioning the linkage, but actually curious just about how to communicate this with others. And so, you know, maybe others being consumers, eaters, and farmers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, first of all, beekeepers are our eyes and ears on the ground. And I think the most important thing is for beekeepers to speak out about their losses. There are a variety. There's one survey, at least for honeybees, a national survey that we've done now for a number of years, where we survey beekeepers who are able to respond and answer questions about the number of hives that they've lost over the course of a year, over a winter. And because of that survey, we do have this correlation, as you've observed and we've covered in this presentation, where there has been a high amount of bee losses or a trend in bee declines and increased use of pesticides. But, you know, surveys are not always the most statistically reliable. And I think it's more important that we hear from beekeepers who are able to say, listen, you know, I just had a bee kill as a result of a pesticide incident, or yes, my operation has declined this much, and it's because I've been exposed to these chemicals and a variety of other threats. So I think to communicate to the public, I can't stress enough the importance of having beekeepers speak about these issues. They are firsthand there, but beyond that, I think, you know, another problem is that we don't have a survey for the health of native bees. We don't have as good of a grasp on the populations of native bees in the US as we do with managed honeybees. And I think scientists are recognizing that, and there's absolutely more research being done there and more research needed. But in the meantime, the statistics that we do have are strong enough to communicate with. I think graphs are always helpful. Another tool I would point out is not just looking at the population declines in honeybees, but also the declines in honey production, which can sometimes indicate the health of a hive. So if you look at US honey production trends over the last 10 to 20 years, you'll also notice a similar correlation with increased pesticide use, specifically neonics, and a decrease in honey production. So yeah, I definitely think communicating it is important, and I'm grateful that you are communicating this. And I think, at least for me, I'm a visual learner, so the more visuals, the better.
Thanks, Larissa. And the next question kind of speaks to part of your presentation where you talked about the ambitious goals of the national strategy. So the question reads, what sort of changes can we expect to happen from the national strategy for protecting pollinators?
So I think the most visible change that we'll see in immediate terms is habitat, increased habitat, or efforts to restore or enhance habitat. And we'll see this not just on government, federal lands, but we'll also see this in a variety of other private lands. So there are a number of corporations and companies that were involved in this White House plan development. Some are electric and utility companies, some are waste management companies. Some are roadside maintenance crews. So we'll see a lot of habitat now be probably planted or, like I said, enhanced across the country. And I think that that's obviously really visible. And it will be beneficial. Pollinators need more habitat. They need more forage available to them. But I just, I can't stress enough that we need to make sure that those areas are not becoming contaminated with pesticides. And I think the other visible change that we can see is perhaps some support for beekeepers. We'll probably see a lot more attention being placed as this plan continues to roll out in terms of beekeeper and their hive health. And we'll also see some changes to pesticide use on farms as a foliar spray. EPA has already announced some plans to restrict foliar applications on agricultural uses of neonics to certain times, essentially when plants aren't blooming, when bees aren't out foraging, kind of common sense things that we should have already been doing, but now it's just formalized in this plan. But I think the biggest change we'll see is absolutely habitat.
Thanks, Larissa. And then you talked about the kind of importance of farmers speaking up and demanding the uncoated seeds. So the next question asks, are there any campaigns happening to educate farmers about the harms of neonics?
I don't know if there's a formal campaign, but I would say that there are a number of nonprofits who have been fighting really hard over the years to take action on this issue, and we consistently engage in dialogue with farmers. We're encouraging the National Farmers Union to become involved. I think we've made progress. It's been small and it's been slow, but we're going to keep pushing that and keep educating and continue to engage in dialogue with farmers. I don't know of a national campaign per se that's looking to do that, though. If anyone has the ability to start that or interest to start that, I would love to support it. I think it would be incredibly valuable, but I think it would obviously be best coming from a farm organization or a farm group per se, and I think it's definitely needed, as you can see.
Thanks, Larissa. Yeah, maybe that's something for all of us to team up on after this webinar.
Absolutely.
So the next question I want to ask you, which will probably be our final question, but if you could just kind of wrap up the presentation with one kind of take-home message for our listeners, or I know you gave us these 5 key ways to start protecting pollinators, but what's maybe the one most important thing that our listeners could start doing today in their lives?
I'll say it's a tie, a tie between obviously avoiding using these chemicals yourself, which I'm sure so many of the listeners here, all the listeners here, don't use these chemicals already. But the second is have your voice heard. I can't tell everyone enough how important it is to speak up, call your member of Congress, give your input, send a comment to the White House, contact government agencies, contact your city council, talk to your neighbors and get your neighborhood involved. Use your voice, kind of be that leader in your community or just as an individual, as a citizen. And you have that ability. I think sometimes people can become so overwhelmed thinking about, submitting a comment to a government agency or, getting a message through to the White House, or is signing a petition really valuable? And yes, to all of those things are so important. And if they are overwhelming, there are so many resources and so many nonprofits that try very hard to make it as easy as possible for you, whether it's giving you a petition to sign or giving you the link to send a comment to a docket for a government agency, or giving you the number to access the operators at the White House when we do phone banking, or giving you the means to contact your member of Congress or even look up who your representatives are. So absolutely use your voice and speak out about this issue. I think together we've already seen 4 million people across the country demand that the White House take stronger action, and I think we can have millions more in the coming year, and I hope we do.
I think that's a great way to end, Larissa. And thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us today, and it was truly a pleasure to have you. I'd just like to let all of our listeners know that this recording will be posted on foodtank.com later today, as well as our YouTube channel. And our next webinar will be on June 30th. It's actually a rescheduled webinar with Bob Martin, who is going to be presenting on antibiotic resistance. So you can register on foodtank.com. But thank you again, Larissa, and thank you everyone for participating, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thank you, Food Tank.